War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war.
I wanna go early infantry when they send me off to war. I wanna feel the ground beneath my feet and rip hearts out of their cores. I wanna get stuck down in the deepest shit where the guts get raw and sore. I wanna be melee infantry when they send me off to war. Oh, I want a big ol' hammer and be fighting till the break of day. Let me run with old boys like we're charging with the white brigade. Oh, feel the heat of dead men's breath and match the glory with the roar. I wanna be melee infantry.
Welcome to episode 59, the Battle of Marathon. I blame Sir Edward Creasy for forcing my hand here. In 1851, he published the highly influential book called The 15 Decisive Battles of the World. I admit my episode on Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War was not well received, and Creasy Bear, if you know, you know, was strongly influenced by the various Grecian conflicts, with 3 of his 15 battles focused on the Greeks. Fortunately, I hope to describe only these few battles with as little external context as possible. So here goes. The Battle of Marathon took place, not particularly shockingly, on the plains of Marathon, surprisingly 17 miles away from Athens. Here the Persians, under King Darius, landed a force of 25,000 light infantry, 1,000 cavalry, and nearly 100,000 sailors and auxiliary forces, with a fleet of approximately 800 ships. The site was chosen by the exiled Athenian tyrant, the last of who bore that title, and now treasonous advisor to the Persians, Hippias, who hoped that Persian victory over the Athenians would allow him to reclaim his tyrancy. While Persian troops unloaded, the warned Athenians quickly marched to block the exit from the plain with 10,000 heavy infantry, the hoplites. Joining them were an additional 1,000 hoplites from Plataea, a small city which contributed a greater proportion of hoplites than even Athens itself. The narrow passage and highly trained hoplites could keep the initially disorganized Persians confined to the coastal plain, but needed additional troops to dislodge them from the landing site. A dispatch runner, known variously as Phidippides or Philippides, was dispatched to Sparta to request their assistance. Sparta, in the midst of one of their innumerable religious festivals, replied they could not join the Athenians for another 10 days. So here's where time and tempo weighed in. The Athenians were well situated, close to home, so logistically well supplied, with their lines of communication well established, surrounded by impenetrable obstacles on both sides of their lines, whether natural or man-made is debatable. As was the custom, the Athenians had 10 stratego, each representing the 10 tribes. The overall commander was the Polemarch Callimachus. His primary advisor was Miltiades, who had fought the Persians for years during the Ionian Revolt and had the most amount of experience against them. Herodotus argued that Miltiades was eager to fight immediately, but as it was 5 days past with no action, it appears as though he may have been wrong. Unless the Persians were particularly disorganized, this would seem to be a foolish course of action, with Spartan reinforcements only days away. Regardless, a stalemate that lasted for 5 days was broken when the Athenians attacked the Persian lines. Why the Athenians attacked without waiting for the Spartans is debated. The leading theory was the Persians re-embarked their cavalry, attempting to use an amphibious assault elsewhere to attack the mostly defensive Athens, an indirect approach. While this is not explicitly written, what is widely accepted is that the cavalry took no part in the battle. Another theory is that the Persians were preparing to attack the Athenian defenses, and the Athenians executed what is known as a spoiling attack. A spoiling attack is where one party attacks before the other who is planning to attack. Regardless, the Athenians attacked the superior Persian forces. The amount of Persians is actually unknown, with some numbers guessed at as high as 600,000, which geographically and nautically seems impossible. This was an asymmetric fight. The hoplite phalanx was unbeatable by the lightly armed Persian infantry in a straight-up melee. But in the open plains, the flanks and rear of the phalanx would be highly vulnerable to the maneuvering Persian cavalry. The Persians were equipped with thousands of archers. It is possible that the Athenians were compelled to move as a result of an attempted attrition by arrow barrage. Regardless, the Athenians attacked first, but were almost certainly reacting to some action on the part of the Persians. The Athenians developed their lines exceedingly thin for a phalanx, with the 2 tribes in the center only 4 ranks deep, and the remaining 11 tribes on the wings 8 deep. Why the center was thinned is, again, unknown. This may have been a deliberate strategy heretofore unseen in Greek warfare. It may have been the desire to extend the lines and ensure the flanks remained secure, and trust to the superior training of the hoplites in the center to hold. The 2 sides drew up approximately a mile apart, and the hoplites began their advance. Here the history of Herodotus conflicts with common sense. He claims the Athenians charged immediately. Sprinting 1 mile in armor would be unnecessary and unwise for various reasons. 1. Melee combat is physically exhausting. Saving your energy is essential. 2. Running would disintegrate the lines, causing those most fit to arrive first to be slaughtered in isolation. Those less fit would arrive exhausted and incapable of offense or defense. Most likely the hoplites marched at a walking pace until the Persian arrows began to fall upon them, probably at about 200 meters. And, at this, the Athenians and Plataeans would have begun, if not a sprint, then a spirited trot to close the distance. It was this gap of 200 meters that was the critical part of the battle. Here the standoff of the Persian archers had all the advantage. Keep in mind also that this was not the era of the latter Macedonian-esque hoplites with glimmering bronze armor. Rather, the armor was mostly leather and more primitive, yet effective against small arrows and glancing blows of swords. The thin lines of the Greeks also proved another advantage as it increased their mobility. Ranks 20 deep would be incapable of sprinting at any speed. By thinning the lines, the mobility advantage was gained. To the human element, being subjected to approximately 100,000 arrows over the space of 1 minute would break the spirit of many armies. The Greeks maintained their momentum and discipline in the face of the barrage. Why? Well, for one, the Persians were following up their successful crushing of Ionia. Miltiades had fought there and saw the brutal suppression of the Ionians, who were themselves a colony of Athens, kinsmen, in fact. The Athenians were well aware that, should they fail in repulsing the Persian invasion, their nascent democracy would fall again to the Persians or a Persian-selected tyrant. Their hard-won status as citizens would revert to that of slaves, if not executed traitors. Their wives and children would be subjected to the same. The Athenians had but little choice: win or be conquered. At contact, the thin center gave way after prolonged fighting, and Persians drove the Athenians back. Again we trust to Herodotus, whom I quote. They fought a long time at Marathon. In the center of the line, the foreigners prevailed, where the Persians and Sakia were arrayed. The foreigners prevailed there and broke through in pursuit inland, but on each wing the Athenians and Plataeans prevailed. What a long time is can be debated. I suspect no longer than 10 minutes, which would seem an eternity to a 4-rank-deep line of infantry. Regardless, the center gave ground, but, critically, it appears, did not break. The stronger wings defeated their Persian opposites, but instead of pursuing, instead turned inward to support the weakening center. This was the key second moment of the battle. This developed into what would now be called a double envelopment. There are 2 ways to execute this tactical, and at times operational, maneuver. The first is to penetrate the flanks. The second is to allow the enemy center to advance. Either technique creates what is known as a salient, which in military terms is any position projecting into otherwise enemy territory. A salient is essentially a position surrounded on 3 sides by the enemy. By Jomini's definition, a losing position. The salient always provides a lucrative target. The Germans in World War I attempted to entrap the French by deliberately creating a salient at Verdun and enticing the French to attack there while relying on the strength of the defense to break the counterattack. Turns out each side lost similarly horrific numbers of men, but that was the idea. By creating an enemy salient, this gives a few advantages. 1. It is increasingly easy to turn a salient into a completely surrounded island, but this too has disadvantages. When completely surrounded, the troops may fight much harder with 0 alternatives, returning to Sun Tzu and his commandment to always leave an outlet. The army caught in a salient may choose to flee, hoping to avoid complete encirclement. And it is in this rout that the true victory is seized. It was the latter that ended up happening at Marathon. Ordinarily, the cavalry-less heavy infantry of the Greeks would be incapable of exploiting the running, faster Persians, with one notable geographic exception. The Persians could only escape by sea. Re-embarking onto their ships takes time, and the marching, disciplined heavy infantry quickly caught and slaughtered the broken and unorganized Persians. While most of the ships were able to sail unmolested, they did abandon thousands of Persian infantrymen. The casualties were as lopsided as the narrative would indicate. Herodotus states well over 6,000 Persian bodies were counted on the plain, with an unknown amount, but certainly well over 1,000, hunted down and killed as they managed to escape or drown in the swamps surrounding the beaches of Marathon. The Athenians and their Plataean allies lost approximately 200, to include the supreme commander, Callimachus, and one of the tribal generals. It is a credit to the Greeks that their leadership invariably fought in the front ranks. Whatever errors Callimachus made in the conduct of the battle, and few are to be found, he paid the ultimate price for them. The battle was won, but as the bulk of the fleet and much of the infantry did manage to escape, the threat to Athens remained. The concern here was the fleet would arrive in Athens, undefended and ignorant of the victory at Marathon, would quickly surrender to the Persians, rendering the tactical victory irrelevant in the strategic sense. And here fleet-footed Philippides was again dispatched to inform the Athenian government of their decisive win and the imminent arrival of her victorious hoplites, save the two tribes who fought in the center, who were given the honor of holding the battlefield and rendering honor to the dead. Philippides, in this final action of heroic patriotism, then died. But that is apparently bullshit. The real run was the far more difficult 150 miles to Sparta, where the assistance he requested was rebuffed. In fact, it was the hoplites themselves who marched the 25 or so miles, now immortalized as 26.2, that gave first news of their victory. It was Plutarch, 600 years later, who created the famous sprint to the death of Philippides. And it was this story, repeated in various ways through the millennia, which inspired the Greeks to resurrect the tale when they hosted the first modern Olympics in 1896 and created the marathon run. The name Philippides itself is wrong, first used by Lucian in roughly 200 AD. In Herodotus' original, it was Phidippides. So why is the Battle of Marathon, which has little overall significance to Darius's massive empire, so important? It protected Athenian democracy in its fragile infancy. The cultural greatness that was to stem from this magnificent experiment would possibly never blossom. Hence no Rome, no Britain, no America. Certainly a stretch, but had the names of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle been lost to toil as slaves to a Persian empire, we really cannot imagine the results. It demonstrated that disciplined heavy infantry could triumph over superior numbers of lesser trained men. This demonstrated that the smaller power could resist the masses of empire if properly equipped, trained, and led. That abandonment of sovereignty was not the inevitable price of cultural survival. There were other battles, larger and more important, previous to Marathon, but it demonstrates the inherent Western-centric nature of Western military history and thought, and the lessons, whether Western, Eastern, or any other points of the compass, remains eternal. Next week, save any massive change to current events which seem to be happening with ever-accelerating pace, we will go over, in detail, the Battle of Syracuse, the brutal ending of Alcibiades' disastrous Sicilian campaign, touched briefly during our discussion of the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides. If another subject is on your mind, please let me know. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.